The air over the tarmac at the Ares Advanced Flight Warfare Center shimmered, a visible manifestation of the pressure that permeated every molecule of the place. Here, the best of the best were forged into living weapons, and the weak were ground into dust. For Cadet Anna Rostova, the dust was beginning to feel like her native element. Her every action in the cockpit of the T-38 Talon supersonic trainer was a study in minute, frustrating errors. A slightly wide turn, a hesitant throttle adjustment, a landing approach that was technically safe but aesthetically sloppy. In the world of aerial combat, where perfection was the baseline for survival, her performance was a death sentence. Major Corbin Vance, call sign Viper, the lead instructor whose ego was matched only by his formidable flight record, saw it as a personal insult. He stood before her now, his office a sterile cage of polished awards and framed photographs of him looking heroic. His arms were crossed, the muscles in his forearms taut beneath his flight suit, a predator sizing up prey that had already surrendered. Rostova, he began, his voice a low growl that vibrated with condescension. Let's cut the charade. You don't have it. Whatever it is, you were born on a different planet. Your reaction times are glacial, your instincts are non-existent. Every time you climb into that cockpit, you are a liability to yourself, to this institution, and to the taxpayers. Anna stood at parade rest, her gaze fixed on a point just over his shoulder. Her expression was neutral, a placid lake in a hurricane, which only seemed to infuriate him more. Sir, I believe with more time. She started, her voice measured and calm. Vance slammed a hand down on his desk, the sound cracking through the quiet room. Time? You've had more time than any cadet I've ever seen struggle this badly. We are not a remedial school. We are the tip of the spear. And you, cadet, are dull. You are a butter knife in a sword fight. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. This is not a suggestion. This is a directive. For the good of the program, you will tender your resignation by 1600 hours. Or I will personally ensure your washout is so spectacular, you won't be able to get a job flying tourists over the Grand Canyon. He sat back, a smug finality in his posture. You get one final flight. Your check ride. A formality. Don't break my airplane. Dismissed. Anna walked from his office, the echoes of his dismissal ringing in her ears, yet her core remained unnervingly still. She did not feel the sting of failure he intended, but a quiet, profound sense of sorrow. Not for herself, but for him. For a system that could look at a person and see only a set of metrics, a checklist of preconceived notions. She walked past the other cadets, their whispers and sideways glances like a physical force. They saw the charity case, the woman who somehow slipped through the cracks of the elite screening process. They saw the clumsy pilot, the guaranteed washout. They did not see the nights spent poring over fluid dynamics textbooks, not to pass exams, but for the sheer love of the physics. They did not see the hours in the simulator, not practicing the required maneuvers, but testing the absolute limits of the digital airframe, pushing it into scenarios the programmers never intended. Her perceived errors were not born of incompetence, but of a struggle to unlearn. To force a master's hand to mimic the clumsy strokes of an amateur was an agony of its own. She had been taught to fly by a different standard, in a world where the rules of engagement were written in blood and secrecy. Here, she was being asked to paint by numbers, and her hand, trained for the subtle, violent brushstrokes of a masterpiece, kept slipping. As she approached her locker, she paused, her fingers tracing the cold metal. Resignation. The word tasted like ash. But her promise had not been to graduate. It had been to try. To see if she could fit, if she could bury the ghost that flew with her and become someone new. The final flight, he'd called it. A formality. For him, perhaps. For her, it was a eulogy. One last dance with the wind and the fire, a final goodbye to the only cathedral she had ever known. She would not resign. She would be dismissed. She would let his judgment stand, a final act of humility. But she would fly. One last time. The pre-flight briefing room was thick with testosterone and the scent of stale coffee. Major Vance stood before the assembled cadets, a pointer stick in his hand that he used more like a weapon than a tool. He detailed the day's evaluation parameters, but his eyes kept flicking to Anna, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "The weather is clear, visibility unlimited," he announced, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "So there will be no excuses for sloppy navigation." A few of the cadets chuckled. "Rostova, you'll be in Talon 7. Maintenance just cleared it, but she's temperamental. Likes a firm hand. Try not to upset her." The implication was clear. He was giving her the Hangar Queen, the jet with a history of minor, irritating gremlins that could rattle a novice pilot. It was a final, petty twist of the knife. Anna simply nodded. "Understood, sir." She went through her pre-flight checks with a methodical grace that went unnoticed. She ran her gloved hand along the fuselage of Talon 7, not as a pilot inspecting a machine, but as a rider greeting a familiar, spirited horse. She felt the subtle vibrations of its systems, the low hum of its soul. In the control tower, General Marcus Hayes, the 4-star commander of the entire Air Education and Training Command, had decided to observe the day's evaluations. He was a man who preferred raw data to mess hall gossip, and he liked to see his investments firsthand. He watched Anna's methodical walk around on the high-resolution monitor. "Vance seems to have it in for that one," he remarked to the tower controller, a seasoned master sergeant. "She's been on the bubble since day one, General," the sergeant replied, keeping his tone neutral. "Major Vance runs a tight ship," Hayes grunted, his eyes fixed on the screen. "There's a difference between a tight ship and a sinking one. Let's see what the telemetry says." He settled into a chair, his presence lending a new weight to the routine procedures of the day. He watched as Anna climbed into the cockpit, her movements economical and precise, a stark contrast to the fumbling image Vance had painted. The flight began as everyone expected. Anna's takeoff was solid, but her initial maneuvers were, to the watching eyes of the other instructors and cadets, textbook examples of her flaws. She banked into a turn a fraction of a second too late, pulling fewer GS than the maneuver called for, making the arc wider than it should be. She overshot her altitude marker by 100 feet before correcting, a clumsy, slow adjustment. In the tower, Vance was providing commentary to the other instructors, his voice laced with vindication. "See? Look at that. Hesitation. No feel for the energy state of the aircraft. She's flying behind the jet, not with it." General Hayes said nothing, his eyes glued to the bank of monitors displaying Talon 7's telemetry. The numbers told the same story as the visuals. Her control inputs were soft, her flight path inefficient. Yet there was something else in the data, a whisper of information that didn't align with the picture of an incompetent pilot. Her heart rate. While every other cadet's biometrics showed a heart rate of 140 or 150 beats per minute under the stress of evaluation, Anna's was a steady, rhythmic 72. It was the resting heart rate of a meditating monk. Hayes leaned closer, his brow furrowed. It was an anomaly, a piece that didn't fit the puzzle. It was the calm before a storm he couldn't yet see. "All right, Rostova." Vance's voice crackled over the radio, sharp and impatient. "Let's not drag this out. Conclude your sequence and bring it home, Roger Viper," Anna's voice replied, betraying no emotion. Proceeding to final approach checklist. She was at 15,000 feet, beginning a gentle descent toward the base, when a sudden, violent shudder ripped through the airframe. A piercing alarm shrieked through the cockpit, a sound designed to incite panic. A cascade of warning lights lit up the main display like a deadly Christmas tree. Hide fail. FLT control fault. On fire right. The stick in Anna's hand went limp for a terrifying half-second before kicking violently to the left. The world outside her canopy dissolved into a sickening, spinning blur of blue and brown. The T-38 had entered a catastrophic, unrecoverable flat spin. "Talon 7 is in a spin! Unrecoverable spin!" the tower controller shouted. The calm, professional atmosphere of the room evaporated, replaced by a frantic, controlled chaos. "Talon 7, eject! Eject!" Vance commanded, his voice tight with alarm. An aircraft was replaceable, a pilot was not. That was the doctrine. Rostova, do you copy? Punch out! On the screen, General Hayes watched the telemetry go insane. The altitude was plummeting. 14,000 feet. 13,000. The spin rate was increasing, a gyre of death pulling the jet and its pilot toward the desert floor. The tower was preparing for the inevitable, already beginning the crash response protocol. They were no longer trying to save the pilot. They were preparing to locate the wreckage. She's not responding, Vance said, his face pale. She must be disoriented from the GS. She's going to ride it all the way in. There was a grim finality in his tone, the sound of a man closing a file. But General Hayes saw something else. Through the maelstrom of failing systems and fatal trajectories, one number remained steady. Her heart rate, 74 beats per minute. It hadn't budged. In the spinning cockpit, a profound transformation occurred. The hesitant, clumsy cadet was gone. In her place sat something else entirely, a being of pure, cold focus. The mask of mediocrity she had worn for months shattered, and the true face beneath was revealed. It was a face of terrifying competence. Her eyes, which had always seemed placid and distant, were now alight with an intense, analytical fire. They scanned the instruments not with panic, but with a predatory calm, absorbing data at an impossible speed. The spin, the alarms, the impending impact, they were not sources of fear, but variables in a complex, high-stakes equation. Her breathing was deep and even. Her mind, a razor-sharp supercomputer, was already 10 steps ahead of the disaster. Asymmetric hydraulic failure in the right stabilator actuator, leading to a feedback loop in the flight control system. Right engine fire is a sensor ghost from the electrical surge. Spin is flat, stable, but accelerating. Ejection is not an option. The thought processed in a nanosecond. The spin was too flat, too violent. Ejecting now would likely send her into the path of the spinning tail. It was a death sentence. There was only one way out. Through the fire. Talon 7, this is Viper. Eject now. That is an order. Vance's voice screamed over the comms, a distant, irrelevant noise. Anna reached up and calmly switched her comms to the emergency-only channel, silencing the distraction. She had a job to do. Her gloved fingers moved over the console with a speed and certainty that defied her previous record. She manually disengaged the flight control computers, cutting the corrupted brain out of the system. She now had direct, raw control over the control surfaces, what little control remained. Her left hand pushed the left engine throttle to full military power, while her right hand slammed the right engine throttle to idle cutoff, deliberately unbalancing the thrust. It was a maneuver straight out of a test pilot's nightmare, something you discussed in theory but never, ever attempted. The controlled chaos in the tower became stunned silence. On the main screen, something impossible was happening. Instead of a random, tumbling descent, the telemetry for Talon 7 began to show patterns. Wild, terrifying patterns, but patterns nonetheless. What is she doing? An instructor whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. General Hayes was on his feet, his eyes locked on the G-force meter. Dear Lord, he breathed. Anna had forced the jet out of the flat spin and into a violent, high-alpha dive. The airframe screamed in protest, groaning under stresses it was never designed to withstand. Then she did something that broke every rule of aviation. She pulled back hard on the stick while applying full left rudder, intentionally throwing the jet into an even more violent, controlled departure from flight. She was using the jet's own instability as a tool. The G-meter, normally green, then yellow, shot past the red line marked for maximum structural integrity, and into a second, deeper red zone, the one that indicated fatal G-loads for a human pilot. 9 GS, 10. 11. It flickered for a horrifying moment at 125 GS. The number was a death sentence. No human body could sustain that, not even for a second. The blood would be forced from the brain, leading to instantaneous blackout and likely a massive stroke. In the tower, Vance stared, his jaw slack, all color drained from his face. It's a sensor malfunction. It has to be, he stammered. But General Hayes knew it wasn't. He was witnessing a ghost. A legend he had only ever read about in classified reports so secret they were practically myths. He was watching the pilot's equivalent of a human lifting a car. He was watching the phantom clutch, a theoretical, unsanctioned recovery maneuver whispered about by Black Ops test pilots, designed to use controlled, asymmetric G-force to literally wrench an airframe back into a stable aerodynamic state. It was considered a suicide maneuver, a last-ditch theory that no one had ever survived. The G-force held at that impossible peak for exactly 18 seconds. Then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The alarms in the cockpit cut out one by one. The violent spin stopped. The world outside the canopy snapped back into a stable horizon of blue sky over brown earth. The T-38 was flying straight and level, bleeding airspeed but miraculously whole. A collective gasp went through the control tower. People who had been sitting were now standing. People who had been standing were now gripping their consoles for support. They had just witnessed a resurrection. On the screen, the altitude reading, which had been plummeting past 5,000 feet, stabilized. The jet was saved. The pilot was alive. Silence. Complete, profound, reverent silence. It was broken by the voice of General Hayes, a voice that was no longer observational, but filled with a thunderous, urgent authority that rattled the windows. "Get me a direct channel to that pilot." Now. The master sergeant, his hands shaking slightly, complied. "Ma'am. Talon 7, tower acknowledges, recovery." Anna's voice came back over the speaker, and it was the same calm, measured tone she had used all day. But now, it sounded entirely different. It was not the voice of a timid cadet, it was the voice of absolute command. "Tower, this is Talon 7. Declaring an emergency. Right engine is out, full hydraulic failure, flying on manual reversion. Requesting a straight-in approach to runway 3 right. The fire was a ghost. Airframe is compromised but stable. I have the aircraft." Major Vance stared at the speaker as if it had just spoken in tongues. His entire worldview, his carefully constructed hierarchy of skill and dominance, had been vaporized in less than 30 seconds. He saw the looks on the faces of the other instructors, the awe on the faces of the cadets listening in. His authority was gone, replaced by a gaping void of humility. Anna landed the crippled T-38 with the delicate precision of a surgeon. With no hydraulics, she used differential braking and rudder, coaxing the wounded bird onto the centerline with a gentleness that seemed impossible. The moment the jet rolled to a stop, the runway was swarmed with emergency vehicles, their lights flashing in the harsh sunlight. But Anna ignored them. She calmly went through the shutdown sequence, her movements as serene as if she had just completed a routine flight. As she finally unstrapped and opened the canopy, the first person she saw was not a firefighter, but Major Vance, jogging toward the aircraft, his face a confused mask of shock and dawning horror. But before he could reach her, a new figure stepped onto the tarmac, intercepting him. General Hayes walked with a purpose that parted the sea of emergency responders. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stopped directly in front of Vance, his shadow falling over the instructor. "Major," the general said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You are to return to the tower. You will gather every instructor from this program. You will wait for me in briefing room 1. You will not speak to Cadet Rostova. You will not look at Cadet Rostova. Is that understood?" Vance, for the first time in his career, looked like a cadet himself, scared, confused, and utterly outranked. He could only manage a choked, "Yes, General." He turned and walked away, a man visibly shrinking with every step. General Hayes then turned his attention to Anna, who was now climbing down from the cockpit. He simply stood and watched as she completed her post-flight inspection of the damaged jet, her focus absolute. She moved with a quiet dignity, ignoring the dozens of awestruck eyes fixed on her. She had not performed for them. The flight, the disaster, the miracle, it was a private conversation between her and the sky. When she was finished, she finally looked at the general and gave a simple, respectful nod. He returned it, his eyes filled with a look of profound, almost reverent understanding. An hour later, briefing room 1 was suffocatingly silent. Every instructor, including a pale and shaken Major Vance, sat at the long table, their eyes fixed on the door. The air of arrogant confidence that usually filled the room was gone, replaced by a tense, fearful uncertainty. The door opened and General Hayes entered, followed by Cadet Anna Rostova. She was still in her flight suit. She took a position at the back of the room, standing at ease, her expression unreadable. The general did not go to the podium. He walked to the center of the room and simply stared at the faces before him, letting the silence stretch until it was unbearable. For the past 3 months, he began, his voice a low, cold instrument of judgment. You have had a legend walking among you. And you saw nothing but a failed cadet. He gestured to the main screen. Lights, the room darkened, and an image appeared on the screen. It was a heavily redacted personnel file. The name read, Anna Rostova. But the call sign beside it made several instructors flinch. Call sign, Spectre. Major Vance, the general said, his eyes locking onto the man. You told Cadet Rostova she was a butter knife in a sword fight. The pilot you call the butter knife holds the unofficial altitude record in a hypersonic reconnaissance vehicle that officially does not exist. She is the only pilot to successfully recover an X-47B from a complete systems failure during carrier landing trials. She has over 2,000 hours in experimental airframes that would make AT-38 feel like a child's toy. He clicked a button. A new page appeared, a list of commendations so heavily classified that most of the text was just black bars. But the citations that were visible were stunning. The Distinguished Flying Cross. The Air Medal with Valor. A presidential citation for actions above and beyond the call of duty in a non-declared theater of operations. The pilot you wanted to wash out for sloppy flying was sent here under my personal authority for a de-escalation protocol. After her last assignment, she needed to remember what it was like to fly without the weight of national security on her shoulders. She was trying to unlearn how to be a weapon. She was trying to learn how to be a pilot again. And you met her humility with arrogance. You met her dignity with contempt. He looked around the room, at every stunned face. She wasn't failing your tests. You were all failing hers. He turned to Anna. Major Rostova. He said, the promotion effective immediately. Your request for a quiet life is denied. I'm assigning you as the new head of curriculum development and lead instructor for this program. Your first duty is to teach these men the difference between a pilot and a warrior. Vance looked as if he had been physically struck. The room was silent, the only sound the quiet hum of the projector displaying the record of a ghost who had just become their commander. Anna stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the men who had mocked her. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of revenge. There was only a quiet strength, a serene authority that was more powerful than any shouted order. The last had just become first, and the new day at Ares had just begun.